Think you really know history? What if I told you that gladiators almost never fought to the death, Vikings didn't rock horned helmets, and Napoleon wasn't even short? So much of what we think of as historical fact is just really good storytelling. For centuries, these tales have been passed down, spruced up, and cemented in our culture by movies, books, and even our school textbooks. They're dramatic, they're exciting, and in a lot of cases, they're flat out wrong. In the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the layers of legend to get to the real story. We're setting the record straight, and together, we're going to uncover some of the most shocking truths your history class never taught you. Get ready, because the past is about to look a whole lot different. Let's start with a scene you've probably imagined 1,000 times. The blistering sun over the Giza Plateau, the crack of whips, and thousands of Jewish slaves straining under the brutal Egyptian sun, hauling massive stones to build the Great Pyramids for a heartless pharaoh. It's a powerful image of suffering, a cornerstone of epic movies and a belief many of us hold. But it's a total myth. A fabrication. The real evidence from history and archaeology tells a story that's not just different, but way more fascinating. So, if enslaved people didn't build the pyramids, who did? And how did we get this story so wrong? Let's find out. The truth behind ancient times. Myth number 1. Jewish slaves built the pyramids. The story of slaves building the pyramids is burned into our collective memory, but it has no basis in historical fact. The truth is, the Great Pyramids were built by skilled, paid Egyptian laborers. This wasn't some sentence of hard labor. It was a massive national project, a source of pride that brought the kingdom together. Archaeologists have actually found entire villages near the pyramids, built just for these workers. Digs at these sites have turned up not just houses, but bakeries, breweries, and places to process fish. This was a well-fed, well-organized workforce. What's even more telling are the tombs of the builders themselves, found right next to the pyramids. Being buried in such a holy place was a huge honor, something that would never be offered to slaves. Inscriptions in their tombs proudly list their job titles, like Inspector of the Builders, or Director of the Craftsmen. These were respected professionals, not an oppressed workforce. They were paid in bread, beer, and other rations, and evidence even suggests they had access to medical care. Skeletons found at the site show signs of healed broken bones and even successful brain surgeries, a level of care that just doesn't line up with the idea of disposable slave labor. So where did the myth come from? The idea probably got popular from a mix of sources. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries after the pyramids were built, described a system of seasonal, drafted labor, which could have been misunderstood over time. But the real fuel for this myth came much later, from cultural stories and, of course, Hollywood. Epic movies needed a dramatic story of oppression and freedom, and slaves building these huge tombs was the perfect fit. The truth, though, is a story of national pride and incredible human ingenuity, built not by the crack of a whip, but by the organized effort of a loyal and skilled population. Myth number 2, Cleopatra was Egyptian. Cleopatra 7 Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her name brings up images of exotic beauty in Egyptian gowns, a true daughter of the Nile. She's an icon of Egyptian history, a symbol of its power and mystery. There's just one tiny problem. Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian. Not even a little. She was Greek. Cleopatra was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Macedonian Greek descent that ruled Egypt for almost 300 years. The dynasty was started by Ptolemy Isoter, a general and close friend of Alexander the Great. After Alexander died, his huge empire was split up among his top commanders, and Ptolemy got Egypt. He and his descendants ruled as pharaohs, but they stayed fiercely Greek in their culture, language, and identity. For generations, they spoke Greek at court and often married their own siblings, a move that both honored an old Egyptian royal tradition and kept power and money in the family. What made Cleopatra stand out, and ultimately so successful, was that she broke from this tradition of staying separate. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn to speak Egyptian. This was a genius political move. By speaking their language and adopting their customs, she won over the Egyptian people in a way none of her ancestors had. She masterfully presented herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, taking part in Egyptian religious ceremonies and ordering portraits of herself in the traditional Egyptian style. But this was all a carefully managed political image. Genetically and culturally, she was a product of the Greek world. She was educated in Alexandria, a hub of Greek learning, and her worldview was shaped by Greek philosophy, literature, and politics. So, while she ruled Egypt and used its culture to her advantage, her bloodline went back not to the pharaohs of old, but to the generals of Macedonia. Myth number 3, Druids built Stonehenge. Picture Stonehenge. Those massive, mysterious stones sitting silently on the Salisbury Plain. Now, picture a group of bearded figures in white robes, holding long staffs, gathering at the stones to perform ancient, mystical rituals as the sun rises. These are the Druids, the high priests of the Celts, and their link to Stonehenge is one of history's most lasting images. It's also completely wrong. The timeline just doesn't add up. Archaeological evidence, like carbon dating, shows that the main building phases of Stonehenge happened between 3000 and 2000 BC. The huge stone circles we see today were mostly finished over 4,000 years ago. The Druids, on the other hand, were a priestly class that came along much, much later. They show up in the historical record around the 3rd century BC, which means Stonehenge was already an ancient monument that had been standing for at least 1,500 years before the first Druid ever lived. The people who built Stonehenge were from the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, and while their exact beliefs are still debated by archaeologists, we know for sure they weren't the Celtic Druids of the Iron Age. So how did this mix-up get so popular? We can mostly blame antiquarians and writers from the 17th and 18th centuries. Guys like John Aubrey and William Stukeley were fascinated by ancient sites and, with no hard evidence, they took a creative leap. They saw a mysterious temple and knew about a mysterious ancient priesthood, the Druids, and just mashed them together. Stukeley, especially, got obsessed with the idea, publishing detailed and highly imaginative drawings and writings that locked the connection in the public's mind. This romantic, though fictional, link was so strong that it has lasted for centuries, even inspiring modern Druid groups who still gather at the site. But from a historical standpoint, saying the Druids built Stonehenge is like saying the American founding fathers built the medieval cathedrals of Europe. Myth number 4. The Romans salted the earth at Carthage. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage were some of the most brutal conflicts in the ancient world. The story of the final act is legendary. After completely destroying the city of Carthage in 146 BC, the Romans, in an ultimate act of revenge, supposedly plowed the land and sowed it with salt to make sure nothing would ever grow there again. It's a powerful symbol of total destruction, a curse on the very ground itself. And it almost certainly never happened. The first big clue is the total lack of evidence from that time. Not a single historian from that period, not Polybius, who was actually there to see the city's destruction, nor any other Roman or Greek writer, mentions this dramatic act of salting the earth. The story doesn't show up in any historical records until the 19th century. It seems to have started with an 1858 article by a British historian B. H. L. D. Este, and from there it took off, getting repeated in textbooks and popular histories until it became treated as fact. Besides the lack of written sources, the logistics just don't make sense. Salt was a valuable resource in the ancient world. It was essential for preserving food and was even used to pay soldiers. Our word, salary, comes from the Latin salarium, which was the salt ration given to Roman soldiers. The idea that a Roman general would waste a huge amount of this precious commodity on a purely symbolic act is highly unlikely. It would have taken a massive amount of salt and manpower to make the vast farmlands around Carthage barren. In fact, historical and archaeological evidence shows the opposite happened. Shortly after it was destroyed, the area around Carthage was resettled and became one of the most prosperous agricultural regions of the Roman Empire, a major supplier of grain to Rome. The story of salting the earth is a great metaphor for Roman cruelty, but it's a piece of historical fiction, not a real account of events. Myth number 5: Polynesians discovered Pacific islands by accident. For a long time, the main theory about how the vast Pacific Ocean was settled was that it all came down to luck. The picture was of Polynesian sailors in small canoes, getting lost in storms, drifting for weeks, and then, by pure chance, washing up on a new island. This accidental drift theory made them seem like passive victims of the ocean. This view isn't just condescending, it's spectacularly wrong. The colonization of the Polynesian Triangle, a huge area of the Pacific with its corners at Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, was one of the most amazing feats of planned exploration in human history. These weren't drifters. They were master navigators. Polynesian sailors used a highly advanced, instrument-free navigation system called wayfinding. They had a deep and complex knowledge of the natural world. They navigated by the stars, memorizing the rising and setting points of hundreds of them to create a mental star compass. When clouds covered the sky, they looked for other signs. They could read the ocean swells, knowing that different swell patterns pointed toward prevailing winds or distant land. The navigator could feel the subtle movements of the canoe as it cut through these swells, letting them hold a steady course for days. And their knowledge didn't stop there. They watched the flight patterns of migratory birds, knowing that certain species would fly out to sea to fish in the morning and return to land at night, pointing the way to an island they couldn't see. They could spot subtle changes in wind patterns, cloud formations that often gather over islands, and even the reflection of shallow lagoons on the bottom of clouds. These trips were carefully planned. They used large, stable double-hulled canoes that could carry people, plants, and animals across thousands of miles of open ocean. This was deliberate, systematic exploration, a testament to a deep scientific understanding of their environment, passed down for generations through songs and chants. The settlement of the Pacific wasn't an accident, it was an achievement. Myth number 6: Ancient people believed the earth was flat. This is one of the biggest myths out there, that for most of history, people thought the earth was a flat disk, and it took a revolutionary thinker like Columbus to finally convince everyone it was a sphere. The truth is, educated people in the Western world have known the earth was a sphere since the time of ancient Greece. The idea of a spherical earth was first suggested by Greek philosophers like Pythagoras around 500 BC, probably for aesthetic reasons, since they thought the sphere was the most perfect shape. But it was Eratosthenes, a Greek astronomer and the head librarian at the famous Library of Alexandria, who gave the first scientific proof and calculated its circumference around 240 BC. His method was brilliant. He knew that in the city of Syene, now Aswan, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead and would light up the bottom of a deep well. At the exact same time in Alexandria, a city to the north, he measured the shadow cast by a vertical stick and found it was about 7.2 degrees. Since 7.2 degrees is about 1/50th of a full 360-degree circle, he figured that the distance between the two cities must be 1/50th of the Earth's total circumference. After hiring professional surveyors to measure the distance between Alexandria and Syene, he multiplied that number by 50. His final calculation was incredibly accurate, coming within just a small percentage of the Earth's actual circumference, as we know it today. This knowledge was never really lost. Roman scholars like Pliny the Elder wrote about the spherical Earth as a fact, and this understanding was kept alive through the so-called Dark Ages by medieval scholars like the Venerable Bede and Thomas Aquinas. The idea that Columbus had to argue against a flat Earth church is a total fabrication, which brings us right into our next section. The Middle Ages not so dark after all. Myth number 7. Medieval people thought the Earth was flat. So, we've just established that the knowledge of a spherical Earth was common in the ancient world. But surely, after the fall of Rome, during the supposedly ignorant Dark Ages, everyone forgot and went back to thinking the Earth was flat, right? Wrong. This is probably the most famous myth about the Middle Ages, and it was almost entirely made up in the 19th century. Medieval scholars, especially those in the church, had access to the writings of classical authors like Pliny, Aristotle, and Ptolemy, who all clearly described a spherical Earth. Influential early medieval writers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome accepted that the Earth was a sphere. The 7th century monk, the Venerable Bede, wrote about the Earth's sphericity, and by the High Middle Ages, it was standard knowledge in universities. Every major scholar and thinker of the time knew the world was a globe. They even understood concepts like latitude, longitude, and the poles. So where did this flat Earth myth come from? Its popularity can be traced almost entirely to the American author Washington Irving. In 1828 he published A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, a very romanticized and mostly fictional biography. To make Columbus seem more heroic and brilliant, Irving invented a dramatic scene where Columbus bravely argues for a round Earth against a council of ignorant, stubborn churchmen who insist the world is flat. This fictional story was a huge hit, and was soon picked up by school textbooks and popular culture. It created a powerful but false narrative of science versus religion, of a lone genius fighting the superstitions of the medieval past. The truth is, Columbus's debate with the Spanish court wasn't about the shape of the Earth. It was about its size. Columbus, using bad calculations, argued that the Earth was much smaller than it really is, and that he could easily reach Asia by sailing west. His critics, who were actually more scientifically accurate, correctly argued that the ocean was way too big to cross. They were right, of course. Columbus just got lucky and stumbled upon a whole new continent. Myth number 8. Chastity belts were a medieval torture device. The chastity belt is a classic cliché in medieval movies. A cruel knight, heading off to the Crusades, locks his wife into a terrifying iron device to make sure she stays faithful while he's gone for years. It's a symbol of medieval misogyny and cruelty. But if you were to look for a real, verified chastity belt in a medieval dig site, you wouldn't find one. Because they didn't exist in the Middle Ages. There's almost no credible written or archaeological evidence that chastity belts were used during the medieval period. The few times such devices are mentioned, it's in satirical or allegorical texts, not historical records. The first real drawing of one shows up in a 15th century book on military technology called Bellefortis, but it's presented with other wild gadgets, and is widely seen as a joke or a satirical cartoon. The idea of locking someone in an iron device for years is also medically insane. Without regular removal and cleaning, something that goes against the whole point of the device, it would cause horrible infections, injuries, and death pretty quickly. So if they weren't medieval, where did they come from? The chastity belts you see in museums today are almost all fakes from the 18th and 19th centuries. The Victorians, in particular, were obsessed with both medieval romanticism and sexual repression. They likely created these devices as curiosities, projecting their own anxieties about sex onto what they imagined was a barbaric past. Ironically, the only time chastity belts were really used in a non-BDSM context was during this later period, when they were sold as anti-masturbation devices for both men and women, reflecting a Victorian-era medical panic. The medieval chastity belt is a myth, born from Renaissance satire and Victorian obsession, not a real artifact of the Middle Ages. Myth number 9. Medieval people only drank beer and wine because the water was unsafe. Here's another popular image of medieval life: dirty peasants and nobles constantly sipping ale from dawn to dusk because the water was a toxic sludge of filth and disease. It's a fun idea that makes the Middle Ages seem both constantly drunk and incredibly unsanitary. While water quality was definitely a concern, especially in crowded towns, the idea that people avoided water altogether is a huge exaggeration. People in the Middle Ages weren't stupid. They knew perfectly well that clean water was vital for health, and that dirty water could make them sick. They actively looked for clean water sources. Monasteries and castles were often built near fresh springs, and complex systems of aqueducts and pipes were built to bring fresh water into towns. People drank water from wells, springs, and clean rivers. If a water source looked sketchy, they knew to stay away from it. Of course, beer and wine were incredibly popular, but not just as a replacement for water. For the working class, ale, often a low-alcohol, small beer, was a key source of calories. It was like liquid bread, providing energy for a long day of physical work. It was also generally safer than questionable water because the brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed most germs. Wine was a status symbol for the nobility, and was also central to Christian communion. But people drank water right alongside these beverages. Medical texts from the time often recommended drinking clear, clean water for good health. The choice wasn't simply between clean beer and dirty water. It was about what was available, affordable, and safe in any given situation. People drank water whenever they could find a clean source. Myth number 10. Neuschwanstein Castle is a medieval fortress. When you think of a fairy tale castle, the image that probably comes to mind is Neuschwanstein. With its tall white towers, romantic turrets, and dramatic location in the Bavarian Alps, it looks like the ultimate medieval fortress, a place where knights and princesses would fit right in. It's so iconic that it was the direct inspiration for Sleeping Beauty's castle at Disneyland. But Neuschwanstein has about as much to do with the real Middle Ages as Disneyland does. It's not a medieval castle, it's a 19th century palace. The castle was commissioned in 1869 by King Ludwig II of Bavaria, a man often called the fairy tale king. Ludwig was an eccentric and reclusive king who was obsessed with the romantic myths and legends of medieval Germany, especially as they were shown in the operas of his friend and idol, Richard Wagner. Neuschwanstein wasn't built for defense. It was built as a fantasy, a private getaway where Ludwig could escape the modern world and live out his romanticized dreams of the past. The design, created by a theatrical set designer instead of a military architect, is a deliberate work of historicism, a romantic imitation of medieval Romanesque and Gothic styles. Inside, it's even less of a medieval castle. It was fitted with the latest 19th century technology, including central heating, flushing toilets, and even a telephone line. The grand rooms are not drafty stone halls, but lavish spaces decorated with murals of scenes from Wagner's operas. It was a stage set for one man's imagination. Ludwig's obsessive and costly building projects, including Neuschwanstein, drained his personal fortune, and led to him being declared insane and removed from power. He died under mysterious circumstances in 1886, having lived in his unfinished dream castle for only a few months. Soon after his death, the fantasy retreat was open to the public and has been a huge tourist attraction ever since, a beautiful monument to Romanticism, but not an authentic piece of medieval history. Myth number 11, knights in armor had to be hoisted onto their horses with cranes. This is a classic comedy scene, a knight stuck in so much heavy, clunky steel that he can barely move, being slowly winched onto his saddle by a crane before clanking off to battle. It's a myth that perfectly captures the supposed awkwardness of plate armor. It's also completely wrong. The idea that a knight was an immobilized tin can is a huge misunderstanding of what armor was for. A full suit of plate armor from the 15th century was a masterpiece of engineering. It was designed for maximum protection and maximum mobility. A full suit weighed between 45 and 55 pounds, 20 to 25 kilograms, which is less than the gear carried by a modern infantry soldier. Crucially, this weight was spread evenly across the whole body, not all in one spot. The armor was made of dozens of interlocking plates, connected with rivets and leather straps, which allowed for a surprising range of motion. A trained knight in his armor could run, jump, do a somersault, and most importantly, easily get on and off his horse without any help. There are plenty of contemporary accounts and drawings showing knights fighting on foot with incredible agility. They could get up quickly if they were knocked down. The whole point of the armor was to be effective in the chaos of battle, and not being able to move would have been a death sentence. Where did the crane myth come from? It seems to have been made popular as a joke by Mark Twain in his 1889 novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. The image was so funny and memorable that it stuck. In reality, knights were elite, highly athletic warriors, and their armor was the cutting-edge military tech of its day, tailored to be a second skin, not a metal prison. Myth number 12, attackers were showered with boiling oil from murder holes. In any castle siege movie, it's the go-to defensive move. The enemy is ramming the gate, and the defenders rush to the murder holes, openings in the ceiling of the gatehouse, and pour cauldrons of bubbling, boiling oil on the unlucky attackers below. It's a gruesome and effective tactic. While murder holes were definitely real, the use of boiling oil was extremely rare. Just think about the logistics and cost. Oil, especially in the huge amounts needed for defense, was incredibly expensive in the Middle Ages. It was much more valuable as food or for lighting. Wasting a massive amount of it by dumping it on a few soldiers would have been financially irresponsible. Plus, it takes a lot of time and a huge, controlled fire to get a large cauldron of oil to a boil, which would be very hard and dangerous to do at the top of a stone gatehouse in the middle of a chaotic battle. So what did they pour through murder holes? The answer is less cinematic, but still very effective. The most common weapon was simply a big rock. It was free, easy to find, and could do serious damage. Defenders also used arrows, crossbow bolts, and other missiles. When it came to hot liquids, the top choice was usually water. It was free, easy to heat, and while not as dramatically horrifying as oil, a shower of boiling water would still cause severe burns, blind attackers, and create chaos. Other nasty options included hot sand, which could get inside armor and cause agonizing burns, and quicklime, a caustic powder that could burn skin and cause blindness. So while murder holes were indeed used for murder, the weapon was far more likely to be a simple stone or a bucket of hot water than a precious cauldron of boiling oil. Modern misunderstandings. Myth number 13, George Washington had wooden teeth. This is one of America's most famous and folksy myths. The image of the first president grimacing with a set of splintery, wooden dentures is practically part of our national folklore. It makes him seem more rustic and relatable. But George Washington, who had terrible dental problems his whole adult life, never, ever had wooden teeth. The truth is much more complicated and, in some ways, more grim. Washington had several sets of dentures throughout his life, and they were made from a bizarre and expensive mix of materials. His false teeth were carved from hippopotamus and elephant ivory, and held together with gold wires, lead tin alloys, and brass screws. Most disturbingly, they also included real human teeth. It's documented that Washington bought teeth from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, likely to be used in his dentures. He might have also used his own pulled teeth or even animal teeth, like those from cows and horses, which were filed down to fit. Washington's dental issues were a constant source of pain and embarrassment for him. He lost his first tooth at 22 and had only one natural tooth left by the time he became president. The poorly fitting dentures he wore warped the shape of his mouth and jaw, which you can see in some of his famous portraits, like the one on the $1 bill. So why the wooden myth? The most likely reason is staining. The ivory used in his dentures was porous and would have easily absorbed stains from things like wine, giving them a brown, grainy, wood-like look over time. So while the story of wooden teeth is a total fabrication, the reality of Washington's dental suffering was very real and far more gruesomely sophisticated than the simple myth suggests. Myth number 14, Paul Revere shouted, "The British are coming!" It's the legendary battle cry of the American Revolution. Paul Revere, galloping heroically through the moonlit Massachusetts countryside, yelling at the top of his lungs, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" to wake up the colonists and warn them of the approaching army. It's a story made famous by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. And it's almost completely wrong. First off, in 1775, the colonists still saw themselves as British subjects. Shouting, "The British are coming!" would have been confusing. Who was coming? Themselves? Revere's mission was one of secrecy and precision, not loud, random shouting. He was a messenger in a network of patriots, sent to deliver a specific message to key leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington, that the British regular troops were on the move, probably to arrest them and seize military supplies in Concord. Revere's ride was much more low-key and effective than the legend suggests. As he rode, he quietly alerted specific patriot leaders and militia commanders in the towns he passed. The warning he likely used was something like, "The regulars are coming out," a clear and specific message that the British Army troops were marching from Boston. Also, Revere wasn't the only rider that night. He was part of a coordinated effort that included William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, who rode on different routes to make sure the message got through. In fact, Revere was captured by a British patrol before he could even reach Concord. It was Dr. Samuel Prescott who actually finished the ride and carried the alarm to Concord. The image of the lone, shouting hero is a powerful piece of American mythology, mostly thanks to Longfellow's poem written almost a century later, but the reality was a covert intelligence operation carried out by a dedicated network of brave people. Myth number 15, Albert Einstein failed math. This is the go-to story for every student struggling with algebra homework. Don't worry, kid. Albert Einstein failed math, and he turned out okay. It's supposed to be an inspiring story of a late bloomer, proof that early academic struggles don't stop you from becoming a genius. It's a wonderful, encouraging story. And it is completely false. Albert Einstein never failed math. In fact, he was a math whiz from a very young age. The myth seems to have a few origins. One is a simple mix-up of the German school grading system at the time, which was the reverse of what many use today. A 1 was the highest grade, and a 6 was the lowest. So people looking at his transcript later saw low numbers and thought they were bad grades. But the main source of the myth seems to be a 1935 Ripley's Believe It or Not column that made the sensational claim. When Einstein himself was shown the article, he reportedly laughed and said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15 I had mastered differential and integral calculus." And he wasn't kidding. The historical record is clear. By age 12, his parents had bought him advanced math textbooks, which he flew through. By 15, he had taught himself advanced calculus. He did fail an entrance exam to the prestigious Zurich Polytechnic School, but it wasn't because of the math and physics parts. He aced those. He failed the general knowledge sections, specifically in subjects like French and botany. He just took the exam again the next year after some more prep and passed easily. The story of the math failure Einstein is a comforting lie, but the reality is that his genius, especially in math and physics, was obvious from his earliest years. Myth number 16, Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." It's probably the most famous quote ever attributed to a monarch, the ultimate symbol of a ruling class so out of touch that it can't even imagine the suffering of its people. When told that the starving peasants of France had no bread, Queen Marie Antoinette supposedly quipped with icy indifference, "Tuez mangent de la brioche, let them eat cake." This phrase has cemented her reputation as a heartless, clueless queen who got what was coming to her at the guillotine. The only problem is, there's zero evidence she ever said it. The phrase actually shows up long before Marie Antoinette was even on the scene. It was first written down by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book, Confessions, which he wrote around 1767. In it, he attributes the line to an unnamed great princess. At the time this was written, Marie Antoinette was just a young girl in Austria and hadn't even come to France yet. The story itself was probably just folklore, a common tale about a clueless aristocrat that had been floating around in different forms for decades. Some historians think Rousseau might have been referring to Maria Therese, the wife of King Louis XIV, who lived a century earlier. So how did it get pinned on Marie Antoinette? It was a brilliant piece of revolutionary propaganda. Antoinette, being foreign-born, from Austria, a traditional enemy of France, and known for her lavish lifestyle, was an easy target for slander. Anti-monarchist writers and revolutionaries grabbed the quote and attached it to her to stir up public anger and paint her as the villain. The line perfectly captured the perceived arrogance of the monarchy, and became a powerful rallying cry against her. It was a viciously effective smear campaign that has defined her legacy. But the infamous quote is a piece of political libel, not a historical fact. Myth number 17, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Every American kid learns this story. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in doing so, he discovered America. This framing paints a picture of a vast, empty wilderness just waiting for a European hero to show up and put it on the map. This myth isn't just wrong, it erases thousands of years of human history. First, and most obviously, Columbus did not discover a continent that was already home to tens of millions of people. Indigenous peoples had been living in the Americas for at least 15,000 years, maybe even longer. They had built complex societies, huge cities, and sophisticated cultures long before Columbus was even a thought. To say he discovered America is like saying a single tourist who just landed in Paris discovered France. But even if we narrow the definition of discovery to the first European to arrive, Columbus still doesn't get the prize. That honor goes to the Vikings. Norse sagas, which were once thought to be just legends, told of voyages to a new land west of Greenland called Vinland. For a long time, there was no physical proof. But in the 1960s, archaeologists Helga and Stein Ingstad found the remains of a Norse settlement at L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Carbon dating of the site confirmed that Vikings had built a settlement there around the year 1000 C, almost 500 years before Columbus set sail. The settlement had several timber-framed buildings, a forge for working with iron, and artifacts that were clearly of Norse origin. So, while Columbus's voyages were undeniably world-changing, sparking a permanent and brutal wave of European colonization, he was by no means the first person, or even the first European, to reach the Americas. Myth number 18. Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity with a kite. The scene is iconic. Benjamin Franklin, out in a thunderstorm with his son, flying a kite with a key tied to the string. A bolt of lightning hits the kite, travels down the string, and a spark jumps from the key to his knuckle, proving the existence of electricity. It's a thrilling story of scientific discovery and personal courage. But like many stories of its kind, the popular version gets a few key things wrong. First, Benjamin Franklin did not discover electricity. Electrical phenomena like static electricity had been known and studied for over 1,000 years, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Scientists in Franklin's own time were already experimenting with electricity using devices like Leyden jars to store static charges. What Franklin wanted to prove was something more specific, that lightning was a form of electricity. Second, and this is a critical point for his survival, the kite was not struck by a bolt of lightning. If a lightning bolt had actually hit the kite, the massive electrical charge would have traveled down the wet string and killed him instantly. The experiment was much more clever. The goal was for the kite and its wet string to pick up the ambient electrical charge from the storm clouds. The experiment was a success when Franklin noticed the loose threads of the hemp string standing on end, showing there was a static charge. He then moved his knuckle close to the key and a small spark, the same kind you get from walking on a carpet and touching a doorknob, jumped the gap. This proved his theory that the atmosphere during a storm is electrically charged, and that lightning is just a huge natural version of that same static spark. His experiment was brilliant and risky, but its purpose and result were much more nuanced than the myth we all know. It wasn't about discovering electricity, but about proving the electrical nature of lightning, which directly led to his practical invention of the lightning rod. Conclusion. So, from the banks of the Nile to the towers of a Bavarian fantasy castle, it's clear that the history we think we know is often more fiction than fact. The past isn't just a simple collection of stories set in stone. It's a complex, always changing field of study where new evidence constantly challenges what we thought we knew. These myths stick around because they're simple, dramatic, and easy to digest. But the truth, while often more complicated, is almost always more interesting. It shows us a past filled not with one-dimensional characters, but with intelligent, innovative, and complex human beings, a lot like us. History is a puzzle with missing pieces, and by questioning the stories we've always been told, we get one step closer to seeing the real picture. Thanks for joining us on this myth-busting trip through history. If you had fun setting the record straight, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. And now we want to hear from you. What's a historical myth you used to believe? Drop it in the comments below. We might just tackle it in a future video. Until next time, keep questioning.